Now in this video, I want to focus particularly on the division of labor. Marx had read liberal economists of his time or earlier times like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. He understood that one of the ways capitalism was able to produce more income from a given set of resources, especially more income for the capitalist, was by rearranging the way goods and services had been traditionally produced. It does this in particular by dividing labor into distinct and simple repetitive tasks, according to Marx. And this is called the division of labor. In short, it proceeds from a theory of comparative advantage, first articulated by David Ricardo, where he notes that people tend to specialize in what they do well. And if everybody specializes in tasks that they do relatively well, compared with other people, and then trade for what other people can do very well, the overall amount of resources that society can produce from a given set of basic natural resources is expanded. Now, liberal economists, right up until today, usually see this as progress. It's progress because it tends to increase production and reduce costs. Efficiency is a great thing. But Marx saw it as also a problem. Two main problems follow from this reorganization of production, as Marx sees it. The first one is that workers are what we call de-skilled. That means each laborer in the production process is much more replaceable than before. It used to be perhaps that a worker would see through the production of something, like a shoemaker would see through the production of shoes from start to finish, would do many different tasks, and would become skilled in many different tasks. But in a shoe factory, each worker only takes care of one small part of the production process, and therefore, and typically a very simple one. And what that does is it means that each individual worker is much less skilled. Another way of saying this is that each worker is much more replaceable. And more replaceable means less bargaining power in the workplace, lower wages, and typically worse working conditions. So in other words, this de-skilling produced by the division of labor for Marx was one of the sources of the plight of the working class in his day. A second consequence of this reorganization of production is that the work itself was becoming intolerably dull. Rather than taking pleasure, exercising his or her creative faculties and skills and making decisions about what to do and how to do it, the factory worker had become a kind of machine, repeated in the same motions unendlessly, under pressure from the clock, the manager, and maybe later on the conveyor belt. For those of you who've seen Charlie Chaplin's movies, you have an idea of a kind of satirical view of these kinds of factory industrial conditions, but they, in many ways, were also quite real. Now, today, economists would probably note that although most of what Marx is describing indeed did happen at one time, this was only perhaps one phase of industrial capitalism. It's not clear that this is the fault here lies with capitalism per se. It seems that it might be just one particular phase of industrial capitalism, early industrialization, that produced this kind of production process. In other words, Marx could have been forgiven for thinking that problems associated with capitalism, or that these problems were associated with capitalism, when in fact they're just associated with changes in technology. In other words, a socialist factory would have to use a division of labor in much the same way and organize production in much the same way. It's very difficult to make steel or shoes or cars efficiently without the division of labor. On the contrary, you might think, and certainly looking at the development of the economy over the last 50 years, the market actually requires and rewards new and more complex accumulations of skill and knowledge. In other words, the worker of today seems to be much more skilled than the worker in Marx's day. Even though the worker today is much more specialized in some ways, the worker is not always specialized in simple things. In other words, we have accountants and we have lawyers, and we don't just have lawyers, but we have people specializing in particular fields of the law, like disability law or wills and trusts or contracts or what have you. And all of this division of labor enables more to be produced from a given set of resources. So far from becoming less skilled, through specialization. Arguably, the workforce, at least in these latter stages of capitalism, has become much more skilled than in Marx's day.